Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I hope during the next few minutes to give you an overview of how our nation has become so vulnerable in an increasingly complex world. It's one of the things that is most troubling about the state of the world today. Because although we have been a nation at war since the attacks of 2001, we've also been a nation at cyberwar for even longer than that. The problem is nobody bothered to tell us, or at least we weren't listening when they tried. Now, some of our officials have done a good job of trying to warn us. So when she was leaving her post at the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano predicted that we would have some event, some cyber event that would have a serious impact on our lives. This was a prediction. Little did she know that her prediction was approximately 10 years too late. Her problem and ours is very simply put, and that is that there is simply no agreed-on definition of what constitutes a cyber attack. It could be a lot of different things. It is a lot of different things. And they are hard to quantify, they're hard to recognize, and in fact, until your identity is stolen, or your computer system is hacked, or you're hit by some virus or worse yet, ransomware, you have no idea what cyber attack is. Add to that the confounding problem that there simply is no effective deterrence in cyber, and you've got a real conundrum on your hands. Because in order to be deterrent, you've got to figure out who's attacking you and where they're coming from. And as we'll see, that's really at the root of many of our problems. So where are we today? What's going on in the world? Well, just this year, in 2019, there have been 11 million new computer viruses created. I won't even bother to break that down to how many per second that is. There have been 700 new phishing campaigns, that's emails sent out asking you to click on something, in the last day. There's a new piece of malware launched on the internet just about every 4 seconds. And of the internet and its backbone networks, over 500 gigabits per second of traffic, that's traffic going around the world on the internet, is traffic intended to disrupt servers using something called a distributed denial of service. In effect, trying to overload the computers that make the internet work. We don't know how many lockouts there have been due to ransomware, because most of the companies and governments that are hit by this kind of attack won't admit it, for fear of being held up to ridicule, or worse yet, losing their clients. And we also know that there are millions of systems that could have been patched to protect themselves and their owners, but haven't been. Ask yourself, when was the last time you updated every piece of electronics that you own? It is a daunting task. So how to understand the landscape? Well, you have heard a lot of different terms, all of which begin with cyber. There's cybercrime. That's when somebody uses computers and networks to try to get money. There's cyber spying or cyber espionage. That's what the Chinese are famous for, gathering information that is otherwise in the public domain. And then there's cyber war, attacking other countries and our attacking other countries with computers. And all of these things have a lot in common. And in fact, what they have in common is that they share all of the same techniques, all of the same tools. They are, in fact, exactly the same. We call them by different names: cyber terrorism, cyber activism, cyber anarchy. If it has the name cyber, it's all the same. What differs is the objective. You see, for cybercrime, as I said, the objective is just good old-fashioned money. Somebody trying to scam you out of your hard-earned dollars. For cyber espionage, the objective is data. It's knowledge, it's information, it's intellectual property, my specialty. And for cyber war and cyber terrorism, the objective is disruption. Disruption of business, disruption of society, disruption of elections. Disruption, it turns out, is the overarching objective that we have heard the most about in recent years. And that objective has taken the form of what the Russians call active measures. The idea of using computers and networks and social media to sow discord among their enemies, us. So how do we think about what the Russians did in 2016 and, according to all of our officials, are still doing and plan to double down in 2020? It requires taking a step back to understand the new type of Cold War in which we're engaged. During the Cold War, our strategic strategy was called MAD, and not without reason. MAD is mutually assured destruction. It's the idea that when the Russians launch the missiles, enough of our missiles will survive that we can launch a counterattack and barbecue everything that's important in Russia. Truly a mad strategy. Strangelovian, in fact. But in the modern world, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the arising of competing powers and, in fact, non-powers, we're faced with a different strategic stance entirely. And we call that MUD. MUD stands for Multilateral Unconstrained Disruption. Multilateral because it's no longer just the superpowers. Now it's a game that everyone can and does play. Nation states, terrorist groups, business groups, cartels, you name it, they play the game. Unconstrained because although in the Cold War nuclear annihilation threatened all of us, the principal targets were still military, just as they had been in war throughout the ages. But now the targets are everywhere, all the time, everyone. There is no constraint on just a military approach. And disruption, because destruction is not the objective, and contrary to what you may have read, has never been the objective of war. The objective of war has never been the total annihilation of your enemy, unless, of course, you count going after Carthage if you're the Romans. The objective is to convince the enemy that he has lost the war and to disrupt his ability to continue to fight. What that means for us can best be summed up by the head of the U.S. Cyber Consequences Unit, a little-known organization within the Department of Homeland Security, who simply said, there is no MAD in the Cold War sense because you can't be assured of attribution, that is, you can't know who's attacking you. The attack can be anonymous, it can be spoofed. Any of you who have gotten a recent telephone call at home, in your office, or on your cell, seeming to come from next door because it comes from your area code and your exchange, know what spoofing is. The person on the other end of the phone, or in fact the computer on the other end of the phone, may just as well be in Mumbai or Beijing as around the corner from where you live or work. Spoofing is alive and well in telephones, and more so because it was invented in computer networks. And so we face cyber danger. Cyber danger arises because of flaws in systems, access to those systems, and a capability and willingness to exploit those flaws and that access, which leads to vulnerability. The vulnerability is manifest because we have increasingly complex systems. We don't know what we don't know about them, and this leads us to use systems which are inherently insecure. But don't fret, it gets worse from here. The danger is that complex systems, complex software, and complex networks were developed in an era of trust. When the internet began, the internet was a project to connect several computers among universities. It was designed completely without security. The Internet of Things, of which you may have read, is similar. The small computers that control everything from our streetlights and our traffic lights to the heating and ventilation systems in our buildings, to the oxygen systems in our hospitals, were all designed at a time when efficiency was prized over security, and security was not even an afterthought. In an era of trust, these systems were developed and deployed before we knew we had to worry. And this leads to systems that have absolutely unknowable responses to error. Don't believe me? Pull out this gizmo from your pocket. This is complexity. How complex? Well, this animation will help you to understand. Because within this is a computer that is roughly 19 million times more powerful than the computer that landed Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. And we use it to watch videos of cats. Couple that complex hardware with equally complex software, and you've got a true interesting problem, because the software that is embedded in these devices is more software than a typical programmer could hope to read and understand in several lifetimes. It is a collaborative venture of thousands upon thousands of programmers over generations of technology, accreting as it goes and developing errors as it goes. Tie all of this together in the most complex network outside your head, and you find out that we don't even know where here is anymore. And in fact, this leads me to the modestly named Husick's fourth law of computing, that every computer has flaws, complex systems have complex flaws, and almost all complex flaws are unknown until they are exploited in something called a zero-day attack. Zero-day because we don't know about the flaw until it is exploited for harm. And on the 0th day, there is no defense against the flaw being exploited. And the exploitation comes in lots of different guises. Phishing, with a PH, is this idea that you will get an email that appears to legitimately come from, you name it, your bank, your investment advisor, the electric company, the telephone company, your credit card company, and you will not spot the obvious or unobvious flaws in that email before absent-mindedly clicking on the link that it contains, thereby inviting the attack on your own computing system or telephone. Drive-bys are attacks that happen merely because you happen to visit a website, and that website may be addressed in a simple misspelling. You may type in goggle instead of Google, and thereby open yourself up to attack. Man-in-the-middle attacks are even more insidious. You've connected to a Wi-Fi network. It looked fine. It said Starbucks. You didn't recognize that it was STARBUX, but you connected anyway, and there's a malicious computer sitting between you and your bank, and you've just logged on and given it the password, inadvertently divulging it to the bad guys. Bogus networks exist all the time. Lots of us go to airports, and you'll see airports that have Wi-Fi networks called free Wi-Fi or free airport Wi-Fi. And I'll guarantee you that at least 50% of the people who take their phones and tablets and computers into the airport don't give it a second thought and connect to these things that are simply honey traps. Stingrays are slightly more sophisticated. You may have read in the news that the Israelis are believed to have used stingrays around Washington in order to compromise the communications of our president, who insists on using insecure, cheap Android devices for his incessant tweeting. A stingray is basically a cell phone tower in a briefcase, and your cell phone will obligingly connect to it as long as it's the strongest signal in the room. So with a little antenna called a Yagi that is made out of nothing so complicated as a Pringles potato chip can, I can fool your cell phone into connecting to my network instead of AT&T or Verizon. And finally, hardware hacks. Every piece of hardware that is more complicated than a rake or a shovel has a flaw. And that hardware in electronic terms means that it is capable of being compromised, and that doesn't begin to count all of the hardware that has been engineered by spy services all over the world, things that look as simple and innocent as a printer cable, and yet take everything that is in your computer and everything you've ever printed and beam it directly to the people who made the cable. These are available, by the way, routinely on websites, both on the dark web and on Amazon. The exploits are even more numerous than the accesses, and no matter what you call them, from viruses to worms to rootkits to keyloggers, all of them work essentially the same way: to get your hardware to execute code that it was not intended to execute. And doing so is frightfully easy. So that's how people hack our computers, our phones, our tablets, our laptops, all of our hardware. But as I said, it gets worse. Because the question is, what is the most complex system known to man? Because, as I said, complex systems invite complex hacks. And the answer to that is the stuff between our ears. The human brain is the most complex network and complex computational system ever devised. There is nothing more complex, nothing less well understood, and it developed in the evolution of trust. When you knew who your kin were in your tribe or your small band of people, and trust was essential, and the default condition was to trust your relatives rather than to distrust them. You want to see the default condition? Walk around the room and observe how many people do that upon meeting you. They are extending a symbol of trust because, since time immemorial, most of us are right-handed and would therefore wield a weapon with our right hand, and the extension of an empty hand is an invitation of trust. Take that and couple it with sophisticated software and ill intent, and hackers have figured out how to hack the human brain. Social media is the tool of choice because in social media, your attention and your engagement are the goals. Every time you read something that you agree with, a little hit of dopamine goes off in your brain and you want a little more. Every time you see that cute cat video, bang, another hit of dopamine. Every time you see a message from one of your friends, ding, your brain goes off again. And that engagement, coupled with targeting algorithms of unprecedented precision, allows someone with sufficient resources and the will to send messages directly into your brain that trigger those little dings of dopamine, reinforcing your beliefs and allowing them to insert beliefs between your ears without your even knowing it. Because they can target so effectively, they can use discordant messages with different groups, safe in the knowledge that no one will ever catch on. And so the Russians, using systems from a company called Cambridge Analytica in the UK and other similar systems, were able to mine Facebook and Twitter data and figure out how to target specific messages to specific groups in the United States. The Russian troll farm was called the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, and it used fake accounts, hundreds of thousands of them, and they hacked our brains to such an extent that they placed more than 3,500 advertisements on social media during the last election cycle, getting to more than 11.4 million Americans, and sending diverse messages so that people who aligned with the NRA got their messages about the threat to gun rights, at the same time that Black Lives Matter got their messages that were completely 180 degrees out in content, but all intended to do one thing: to convince us that the political system was broken and that we should disengage from it. That the appropriate response to a political system exhibiting gridlock was simply not to participate. Because if you can reduce the number of people who might participate, you can polarize the rest who definitely will. And that is the result in 2016. According to the indictment that was handed down that indicted the Russians of the Internet Research Agency, they addressed topics from immigration to gun control, the Second Amendment, the use and misuse of the Confederate flag, race relations, both pro and con, LGBT issues, the Women's March, and the NFL take a knee debate. This is the Russians doing this. But not just the Russians anymore. Everyone else seems to have learned the lessons of 2016. The danger is that with all of this communication, we are the ultimate target. Now, we should have known that this was going to happen, because back in 1999, the Chinese told us exactly what they would do if there were ever a war between China and the US. Two colonels published a book. You can buy it on Amazon, Unrestricted Warfare. They told us exactly how the Chinese would behave. We read the book, but we failed to understand one important thing. The book was not a prediction, it was a recap. The Chinese believed they were already at economic war with us, and this was an explanation of exactly what they were doing in that war. They did it from this building in Shanghai, and when we caught them at it, their response was, predictably, denial, in which they simply said, there isn't a clear, unified definition of what hacking is, and besides, everybody just gathers information on the internet anyway, so that's what we're doing. Sound familiar? It's the exact script used by Putin in 2017. Now, the US federal government is on the case protecting all of this critical infrastructure for us. But critically, these are the things that the government does not consider to be critical that they should protect. Things like our health care and our manufacturing of computer chips and our voter databases and voting systems. We demonstrated back when Obama was president that control systems could be attacked. We attacked the Iranian nuclear system in something called Stuxnet. And all over the internet, there are control systems that are vulnerable to attack. And yet, our own control systems in this country remain connected and remain vulnerable, even though we taught the world how to do this stuff. So where are we? Well, predictably, we're up a creek without a paddle. Our political system seems gridlocked and unable to take the threat seriously. The threat now comes from all over the world, with everyone having learned how to do this, including Americans who are waging campaigns at this very moment. The problem is we don't know if it's war. Back in 2003, at the beginning of the Cyberwar, a hacker group that I monitor on the internet had somebody post this that said, the Pentagon said, if you shut down our power grid, we'll put a missile down one of your smokestacks. And the hackers said, yeah, well, we got 0 smokestacks, dude. So the Pentagon thinks it knows what it's doing, but they're not paying attention to the guy in the corner. We are continuing to be vulnerable. Malware and ransomware attacks are up, and as if you needed one more piece of good news, our entire nuclear arsenal is judged to be vulnerable. We have not yet begun to fix those vulnerabilities. We don't know if when we press the button the missiles will go up, and if they go up, we don't know where they'll come down. So what can we do? Well, we could use good passwords. You've been told that, right? Everybody keeps yelling at you to change your password. You can't remember any of them anyway. What's a good password? Good passwords are complex. They're never written down anywhere. Forget it. No more Post-it notes. You change them frequently, right? At least every week. They're used in only one system. You never reuse a password from one computer to another. In other words, good passwords are completely impossible. You might as well forget about it. Why? Because a good hacker can check 800 million passwords per minute. And you can't think of that many passwords. So what should we do? Well, we should use two-factor authentication and make our lives miserably difficult. So what's the conclusion? Unfortunately, I don't have any really great news for you. Every war that we're in, the hot ones, the cold ones, and the cyber ones, will use cyber weaponry to focus disruption on us. Our security technologies are not up to the challenge, especially not when a well-heeled nation state is after our data and our way of life. And any defense doctrine based on deterrence, as in do it to us and we'll hit you, is bound to fail because we don't know who you is or where you is. That's the sad state of affairs. We're in a war. We're in a cyber war. We've been in a cyber war with China and with Russia and with hackers known and unknown and with Al-Qaeda and with ISIS, and nobody bothered to tell us. You can choose to be Alfred E. Newman and simply say, what, me worry? Most people that I run into say, well, why would they be worried about my data, my bank account? I'm just small fish. But understand that China's entire mode of operation is gathering every piece of open and closed source information and then stitching it together carefully to create a mosaic of classified information. The stuff you know is part of that. Is the solution to sit in a cave without a computer? Hardly. The solution is to undertake this as a national emergency and to start with the targets of opportunity like our election systems and our media, and to break out of our bubbles so that we're aware that the conflicting messages are being broadcast so that we can arm ourselves to find out what is true and what is not. We each have a responsibility. I hope you take those responsibilities as seriously as I do. It doesn't take a PhD in computer science. It takes having your eyes and ears open and watching for those messages that are clearly intended to hack your own head. And I look forward to your questions.